The morning started like any other on Xerion Prime. Ambassador Jake Morrison walked through the crystal corridors of the Galactic Council building, his boots making soft sounds on the polished floor. He carried a simple datapad and wore the same dark blue uniform he had worn for the past 3 years. Nothing about him suggested that this day would change everything. The council chambers buzzed with the usual noise. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their assigned seats, talking about trade disputes and border conflicts. The Andorian delegates argued with the Corvin Federation about mining rights. The Centauri ambassadors complained about shipping delays. Everything was normal. Jake took his seat in the human section. It was a small area compared to the massive platforms given to the Draxi Empire or the United Sectors Alliance. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for 60 years. Most species still saw them as newcomers who were useful but not very important. Council leader Vorthak called the session to order with a sound that came from his throat. The first topic was the usual business about trade regulations. Jake listened quietly while other ambassadors debated about cargo inspections and tax rates. He had helped write most of these regulations, but nobody seemed to remember that. Then came the military briefings. General Caxorth stood up and talked about recent pirate attacks in the Outer Rim. He used tactical formations that humans had developed, but he presented them as his own ideas. Jake said nothing. He had learned long ago that taking credit was not important. Dr. Narathul spoke next about the recent disease outbreak on Titan 7. She explained how they had contained the virus using new medical protocols. Jake knew these protocols came from human research, but again he stayed quiet. The important thing was that people were safe. The session continued for 2 hours. Trade agreements were signed. Defense strategies were approved. Research projects were funded. Jake participated when asked, offering suggestions that others would later claim as their own ideas. This had been his life for 3 years. When the formal session ended, Jake stood up and requested permission to address the council. Vorthak looked surprised, but nodded. Most human communications were handled through written reports, not public speeches. Jake walked to the central speaking platform. The chamber grew quiet as representatives turned to look at him. He placed his datapad on the podium and looked around the room at faces that belonged to dozens of different worlds. His voice was calm and clear when he spoke. There was no emotion in his words, no anger or disappointment. He simply stated facts like he was reading a shopping list. Earth was withdrawing from all galactic affairs, effective immediately. All human personnel would be recalled from their positions throughout the galaxy. All research partnerships would end. All military cooperation would stop. All trade agreements would be canceled. All diplomatic relationships would be terminated. The chamber remained silent for several seconds. Then Zeftar of the Andorian Trade Collective started laughing. The sound was high and musical, the way Andorians laughed when they found something amusing. Other representatives began to chuckle and whisper among themselves. Vorthak asked if there was a specific reason for this decision. Jake shook his head and said it was simply time for humanity to focus on their own affairs. There were no complaints about treatment, no demands for changes, no threats or ultimatums. It was just a business decision. Several ambassadors asked questions. Would humans reconsider if offered better trade terms? Would they stay if given more representation in the council? Would they change their minds if promised better colony worlds? Jake answered no to every question. The decision was final. Council leader Vorthak seemed confused by the whole situation. He asked Jake to explain what had caused this sudden change. Jake simply repeated that Earth was choosing to pursue independent development. There was nothing more to discuss. The formal announcement took less than 10 minutes. Jake thanked the council for their time, gathered his datapad and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the representatives began talking loudly among themselves. Most seemed relieved rather than concerned. Humans had always been helpful, but they were hardly essential. As Jake left the building, he activated his communication device and sent a single coded message to Earth Command. The message contained just 2 words that would trigger the largest withdrawal operation in galactic history. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, Other humans were receiving similar orders. Captain Lisa Barnes stood on the bridge of the Earth vessel, Meridian, reading the recall message that had just arrived. Her crew included members from 6 different species, all of whom had served with distinction for years. Lisa called her crew together in the main briefing room. She told them that the ship was returning to Earth immediately. All non-human crew members would be transported to the nearest starbase, where they could find new assignments. When asked for reasons, Lisa simply said that Earth Command had issued new directives. Commander Gary Wilson looked confused. He had served on human ships for 5 years and considered the crew his family. Lisa explained that this was not a personal decision, but a policy change that affected all human operations. She assured him that glowing recommendations would be provided for all crew members. Dr. Alex Carter was working late in his laboratory at the Galactic Science Institute when the message arrived. He had been analyzing mineral samples from the newly discovered Kepler system, trying to understand the unusual crystal formations found there. The work was important and could lead to new energy technologies. Alex read the recall order twice to make sure he understood it correctly. Then he began the process of shutting down his research projects. He transferred all his data to the Institute's main computers and wrote detailed notes about his current work, so others could continue where he left off. His colleagues barely looked up when he announced his departure the next morning. Dr. Felnoth was too busy with her own experiments to ask many questions. Professor Yindar simply nodded and wished him well. They assumed Alex was taking a brief leave of absence and would return soon. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out at hundreds of locations. Human engineers left their posts at shipyards and construction sites. Human doctors finished their shifts at hospitals and medical centers. Human teachers completed their classes at universities and training academies. Human traders closed their shops and canceled their contracts. Every human everywhere received the same message and followed the same instructions. Return to Earth immediately. Bring nothing that belongs to other species. Leave detailed records of all work in progress. Offer no explanations beyond the simple statement that Earth was withdrawing from galactic affairs. Within 36 hours, every human ship had departed for Earth. Every human station had been evacuated. Every human outpost had gone dark. Communication networks that humans maintained simply stopped working. Research projects were abandoned half-finished. Trade agreements were left unsigned on desks. The galaxy barely noticed at first. Other species quickly moved to fill the positions left empty by departing humans. Andorian merchants took over human trade routes. Corvan engineers assumed control of construction projects. Draxi scientists continued research that humans had started. Most galactic citizens assumed this was a temporary situation. Perhaps humans were dealing with some internal political crisis. Maybe they would return in a few months with new demands or different leadership. Nobody seriously believed that an entire species would simply vanish from galactic civilization, but that is exactly what happened. Within a week, there was no trace of human presence anywhere in known space. They had walked away in complete silence, leaving behind only empty buildings and unanswered questions. The galaxy continued its business as usual, unaware that the foundation of its civilization had just disappeared. 3 months passed after the humans disappeared and the galaxy seemed to function normally. Trade continued between worlds, ships moved through established routes, and governments conducted their usual business. Most species had already forgotten about humanity's sudden departure. Life went on. Then the first crack appeared. The trouble started in the Centauri Nebula, where the Draxi Empire and the Corvan Federation both claimed mining rights to a small asteroid field. This type of dispute happened regularly throughout the galaxy. Usually these conflicts were resolved quickly through established diplomatic channels, but this time something was different. The mediation protocols that normally handled such disputes were not working properly. Ambassador Velnara of the Centauri worlds found herself dealing with increasingly angry representatives from both sides. The computer systems that usually provided neutral analysis of territorial claims kept giving error messages. Velnara tried to access the conflict resolution database that had successfully handled hundreds of similar disputes over the past decades. The system would not respond to her queries. When she contacted the technical support department, they told her the database had been maintained by human specialists who were no longer available. Without proper mediation, the dispute escalated quickly. The Draxi Empire sent 3 warships to establish a blockade around the asteroid field. The Corvan Federation responded by deploying their own battle fleet. Within 2 weeks, what should have been a minor disagreement had become a major military standoff. Similar problems began appearing throughout the galaxy. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for years started experiencing technical difficulties. Shipping companies found that their logistics software was producing incorrect calculations for cargo loads and fuel requirements. The complex algorithms that optimized shipping schedules were failing. Captain Thurvan of the Galactic Shipping Consortium discovered that most of their routing systems had been designed and maintained by human programmers. Without regular updates and maintenance, the software was becoming unreliable. Ships were arriving late at their destinations or carrying incorrect cargo. The problems were not limited to shipping. Financial markets across the galaxy began showing unusual fluctuations. The economic prediction models that prevented major market crashes were producing strange results. Currency exchange rates started swinging wildly between different sectors. Dr. Quilneth at the Galactic Economic Institute spent sleepless nights trying to understand what was happening to their financial systems. She discovered that the complex mathematical formulas that kept interstellar markets stable had been developed by human economists. Without their ongoing adjustments, the entire galactic economy was becoming unstable. But the worst crisis emerged. In the Outer Rim territories where a new disease began spreading among colonists, the plague started on a small farming world called New Geneva. At first it seemed like a common viral infection that would be easily contained using standard medical protocols. Dr. Narathul arrived at New Geneva with a team of medical specialists and the latest treatment equipment. They followed all established procedures for disease containment. Quarantine zones were established. Medical supplies were distributed. Treatment centers were set up. Everything was done according to the medical handbook. The plague continued to spread. Within 3 weeks it had jumped to 4 neighboring worlds. The standard treatments were not working. The containment protocols were failing. Dr. Narathul realized with growing horror that she was facing something entirely different from anything she had encountered before. She began reviewing historical records of similar outbreaks and made a disturbing discovery. Every major pandemic in the past century had been successfully contained using medical protocols that were originally developed by human researchers. The techniques for tracking disease spread, developing rapid treatments, and implementing effective quarantines had all come from human medical science. Dr. Alex Carter had been the leading expert in pathogen modeling and disease containment. His computer simulations could predict how diseases would spread and identify the most effective response strategies. Without his systems, Dr. Narathul was working blind. The plague spread to 12 worlds before anyone understood its true nature. It was not a natural disease, but an artificial biological weapon that had been dormant in the soil of several outer rim planets. Someone or something had activated it deliberately. The question was who and why. Captain Threndar of the Galactic Patrol investigated the plague outbreak and uncovered evidence of organized criminal activity. Illegal weapons were being smuggled through systems that should have been secure. Black market operations were expanding into territories that had been crime-free for decades. Threndar tried to use the standard law enforcement databases to track the criminal networks. The computer systems that usually provided detailed analysis of criminal patterns and smuggling routes were not functioning properly. The sophisticated tracking algorithms that had kept galactic crime under control were failing without regular maintenance. He discovered that most of the advanced investigative techniques used by galactic law enforcement had been developed by human analysts. The methods for tracking criminals across multiple star systems, analyzing communication patterns, and predicting criminal behavior had all originated from human police science. Without these tools, criminal organizations were operating with unprecedented boldness. Piracy increased dramatically as merchant ships lost the protection of early warning systems. Smuggling networks expanded into previously secure sectors. Black market weapons dealers began selling advanced technology to anyone with enough money. By say, the 6th month after humanity's departure, the problems had become impossible to ignore. 3 entire star systems had been quarantined due to the spreading plague. The hegemony wars between the Draxi Empire and Corvan Federation had claimed 17 planets. Trade routes were failing as shipping became unreliable. Financial markets were on the verge of collapse. Crime syndicates controlled large sections of the Outer Rim territories. Piracy had increased by 400%. Food shortages were developing as agricultural worlds struggled with failing crop management systems. Industrial production was declining as manufacturing processes became less efficient. The Galactic Council held emergency sessions to address the growing crises. Representatives from major powers argued about solutions, while smaller species demanded immediate action. Everyone had theories about what was going wrong, but nobody understood the real cause of the problems. Council leader Vorthak appointed special committees to investigate each crisis separately. The Economic Crisis Committee tried to stabilize financial markets. The Security Committee worked to address the crime wave. The Medical Committee focused on containing the plague outbreak. Each group worked independently without coordination. None of the committees made significant progress. They were trying to solve problems without understanding that all the crises were connected. The systems that had maintained galactic stability for decades were failing because the people who had designed and maintained them were gone. Some individuals began to suspect the truth. Dr. Nara Thul noticed that many of the failing systems had been created or improved by human specialists. Captain Threndar observed that crime had begun increasing shortly after human law enforcement advisors had departed. Ambassador Velnara realized that diplomatic crises were becoming harder to resolve without human mediation protocols. But most galactic leaders refused to believe that humans could have been so important. They were convinced that these were temporary problems that could be solved with enough effort and resources. The idea that a single species could have been essential to galactic civilization seemed impossible. The major powers began competing to fill the gaps left by departing humans. The Andorian Trade Collective claimed they could restore shipping efficiency. The Draxi Empire insisted their scientists could solve the medical crisis. The United Sectors Alliance promised to end the crime wave with military force. Each species believed they were more advanced than humans and could easily replace their contributions. They had never paid much attention to what humans actually did, assuming it was simple work that anyone could handle. Now they were discovering how wrong they had been. As the problems continued to worsen, a few voices began suggesting that perhaps humanity should be contacted and asked to return. These suggestions were quickly dismissed by the major powers who were unwilling to admit they needed help from a species they had always considered inferior. The galaxy was beginning to unravel, but its leaders were too proud to acknowledge the real cause of their problems. 1 year had passed since humanity's silent departure, and the galaxy was falling apart in ways nobody had thought possible. What had started as minor inconveniences had grown into catastrophic failures that threatened the survival of entire civilizations. The problems were no longer isolated incidents but part of a massive system collapse that was accelerating every day. Chief Engineer Korthvan stood in the control room of Defense Station Alpha, staring at warning lights that covered his control. Panels like angry red stars. The galactic defense grid was failing and he had no idea how to fix it. The network of automated defense stations that protected inhabited systems from asteroid impacts and stellar radiation had been working perfectly for over 2 centuries. Now station after station was going offline. The defense stations used quantum processors that required specific maintenance cycles to prevent degradation. Korthvan had the technical manuals, but they were written in human technical language that used concepts his people had never fully understood. The maintenance procedures required tools and techniques that only human engineers seemed to know how to use properly. Dr. Elena Ross had been the chief stellar engineer for the entire defense grid. She had visited each station regularly, performing maintenance that seemed simple but apparently involved knowledge that she had never shared with anyone else. Without her expertise, the quantum processors were beginning to fail one by one. System after system reported the same problems. Defense Station Beta had lost primary power 3 days ago. Defense Station Gamma was operating on backup systems that would fail within weeks. Defense Station Delta had already gone completely dark. Inhabited worlds that had been protected for generations were now vulnerable to cosmic threats that could destroy entire planets. The failure of the defense grid was just one part of a much larger catastrophe. Dr. Yexmal at the Stellar Observation Center had discovered something that made his blood freeze. 3 stars in different sectors were showing signs of instability that could lead to premature collapse. According to his calculations, these stars should have remained stable for millions of years. Further investigation revealed that all 3 stars had been equipped with stellar stabilization technology that prevented the kind of solar flares and magnetic fluctuations that could threaten nearby planets. The stabilization systems had been installed decades ago and required regular monitoring and adjustment to remain effective. Dr. Elena Ross had also been responsible for maintaining these stellar stabilizers. Her departure meant that the delicate systems keeping these stars stable were no longer being properly maintained. Without intervention, the stars would begin experiencing massive solar flares that would sterilize any planets in their systems. Eventually, they might collapse entirely, destroying everything within several light years. The economic situation had become even worse than anyone had predicted. The galactic currency exchange had completely collapsed when traders discovered that the mathematical algorithms preventing market manipulation were failing. Without proper regulation, large corporations and criminal organizations were deliberately causing market crashes to steal billions of credits from smaller investors. Ambassador Rex Toll at the Trade Commission tried desperately to restore economic stability, but the financial systems were too complex for anyone to understand completely. The economic models that had enabled interstellar commerce were apparently human creations that required constant adjustment to account for changing political and social conditions across hundreds of worlds. Entire sectors had reverted to primitive barter systems as their local currencies became worthless. Interstellar trade was grinding to a halt as companies could no longer calculate fair exchange rates or predict market conditions. Billions of beings faced poverty as their savings disappeared in the economic chaos. Food production across the galaxy had dropped to dangerous levels. Agricultural worlds that had fed entire sectors were now struggling to grow enough crops to feed their own populations. The high-yield farming techniques that had enabled galactic civilization were failing as the biotechnology behind them broke down without proper maintenance. Dr. Fintel at the Agricultural Research Institute discovered that most of the advanced farming methods used throughout the galaxy had been developed by human scientists. The genetic modifications that made crops grow faster and larger, the soil treatment processes that increased fertility, and the pest control systems that prevented crop failures were all human innovations. Without human agricultural scientists to maintain these systems, crop yields were falling to pre-industrial levels. Planets that had supported billions of inhabitants were now facing mass starvation. Food riots had broken out on dozens of worlds as desperate populations fought over dwindling supplies. The military situation had become equally dire. General Caxorth reviewed battle reports from across the galaxy and realized that every successful military campaign of the past 2 centuries had used tactical doctrines developed by human strategists. The formations that had won the Great Void War, the strategies that had ended the sector rebellions, and the technologies that had maintained galactic peace were all built on human military science. Without access to human tactical knowledge, military commanders were struggling to deal with conflicts that should have been easily resolved. The hegemony wars had expanded to include 6 major powers and showed no signs of ending. Rebel groups that had been contained for decades were now winning battles against superior forces because traditional tactics were no longer effective. Criminal organizations had grown so powerful that they controlled entire star systems. The sophisticated law enforcement techniques that had kept galactic crime in check were apparently all based on human investigative methods. Without these tools, police forces across the galaxy were helpless against organized criminal networks that seemed to understand the weaknesses of every security system. As each new crisis emerged, a disturbing pattern became clear to those who bothered to look. Every major system that kept galactic civilization functioning had been created, improved or maintained by human specialists. Medical protocols, engineering standards, diplomatic procedures, economic regulations, military doctrines, agricultural techniques, and scientific research methods all showed evidence of human involvement. Dr. Nara Thul spent weeks reviewing historical records and made a discovery that shook her to her core. For the past 600 years, humans had been quietly involved. In every major advancement that had improved life in the galaxy, they had solved problems that other species considered impossible and prevented disasters that would have destroyed entire civilizations. The plague that was still spreading through the outer rim was finally contained, but only after it had killed millions of beings on 47 worlds. The containment had been achieved by cobbling together fragments of human medical protocols that different hospitals had preserved. Even incomplete, these methods were more effective than anything other. Species had developed. Captain Threndar made similar discoveries about law enforcement. The crime wave was beginning to slow down as police forces learned to use simplified versions of human investigative techniques. But the learning process was slow and expensive, requiring years of training that human advisors had provided in months. Ambassador Velnara found partial solutions to some diplomatic crises by studying records of how human mediators had handled similar situations in the past. But without understanding the underlying principles that humans used, each diplomatic success required enormous effort and often failed to address the root causes of conflicts. The Galactic Council held increasingly desperate emergency sessions, as world after world reported new catastrophes. Food shortages, economic collapse, military defeats, medical crises, and infrastructure failures dominated every discussion. Representatives demanded solutions that nobody could provide. Some council members began suggesting that humanity should be contacted and persuaded to return. These suggestions were met with angry resistance from the major powers who insisted that accepting help from humans would be an admission of weakness that would damage their authority throughout the galaxy. Pride prevented the galactic powers from acknowledging what was becoming obvious to everyone else. The humans had not been a minor species that happened to be useful. They had been the invisible foundation that held galactic civilization together. Without them, everything was falling apart, but even those who understood the truth had no idea where humanity had gone or how to contact them. Every attempt to reach human worlds had failed. It was as if an entire species had simply vanished from the universe, taking with them the knowledge and skills that had kept the galaxy stable for centuries. The unraveling continued to accelerate as more systems failed and more worlds faced disaster. Time was running out for galactic civilization, but its leaders were still too proud to admit they needed the help of the species they had always dismissed as inferior. The galaxy was learning a hard lesson about the difference between being advanced and being essential. The galaxy was dying, and its leaders finally understood that only humanity could save it. Desperate times had forced even the proudest species to admit they needed help from the beings they had always considered inferior. The Galactic Council voted unanimously to form an unprecedented alliance dedicated to one purpose: finding humanity and convincing them to return. Admiral Seth Morrison had been chosen to lead the search mission not because of his military record, but because of his name. He was Jake Morrison's younger brother, and the council hoped that family connection might help convince the humans to listen. Seth had served in the Galactic Navy for 20 years and had earned respect from officers of many different species. The A search fleet assembled at Zerion Prime was the largest armada ever created for a peaceful mission. 500 ships from 43 different species joined together under a single command structure. Draxi battleships flew alongside Corvin science vessels. Andorian trade ships worked with Centauri exploration craft. Former enemies cooperated because they had no choice. Dr. Paul Newman led the scientific division of the search fleet. He had worked closely with human researchers for 15 years and understood their methods better than most aliens. The council hoped he could analyze any traces of human technology and determine where they had gone. Paul brought the most advanced scanning equipment available from every major civilization. The fleet departed Zerion Prime on a course toward the Sol system, humanity's original home. Long-range sensors had detected no activity from that direction. since the humans departed, but it was the only logical place to start looking. The journey would take 3 weeks using the fastest hyperspace routes available. During the voyage, Captain Mary Johnson's archaeological team analyzed data from abandoned human colonies and research stations. They hoped to find clues about where humanity might have gone or what their true capabilities really were. What they discovered was far more disturbing than anyone had expected. The abandoned human facilities contained technology that was centuries beyond anything the galaxy possessed. Manufacturing equipment that could create materials with impossible properties. Research laboratories studying scientific principles that other species had never even theorized. Defensive installations designed to withstand attacks from weapons that did not exist in any known arsenal. Mary's team found weapons testing ranges where the targets were made of compressed neutron matter, a substance so dense that creating even small amounts should have required the resources of an entire star system. Human scientists had apparently been working with such materials routinely. The implications were staggering. Commander Steve Adams led the intelligence division that analyzed historical records from human-inhabited worlds. His team discovered evidence that human involvement in galactic affairs went back much further than anyone had realized. Trade agreements from 5 centuries ago showed subtle influences that could only have come from human advisors. Military. Campaigns from before humanity's official first contact bore clear signs of human tactical input. The most shocking discovery came from encrypted files found in an abandoned human embassy. The records showed that humans had been secretly guiding galactic development for over 600 years. Every major decision that had prevented wars, maintained stability, or promoted technological advancement had been influenced by human agents working behind the scenes. Steve's team found references to something called the Galactic Stability Project that had apparently been humanity's primary mission since their arrival in the galaxy. The files mentioned threats from beyond the galactic rim and the need to prepare local civilizations for eventual contact with hostile forces. The documents were heavily encrypted and most of the crucial information remained locked away. As the search fleet approached the Sol system, their sensors detected something that made every crew member nervous. The entire solar system was enclosed in an energy barrier of unknown composition. No signals could penetrate it, no matter how powerful. Visual scanning showed the barrier as a shimmering dome of energy that surrounded the system at a distance of several billion kilometers. Admiral Seth Morrison ordered a careful approach to the barrier. When the first scout ships came within scanning range, they discovered that the energy field was far more sophisticated than it appeared. The barrier seemed to analyze every ship that approached and adjust its properties accordingly. Weapons fire had no effect. Attempts to find weak points failed completely. Dr. Paul Newman spent days analyzing the barrier with every instrument at his disposal. The energy patterns were unlike anything in known physics. The power requirements to maintain such a construct would equal the output of several stars operating at maximum efficiency. The technology required was so far beyond galactic capabilities that it seemed almost magical. Any ship that approached too closely was gently but firmly pushed away by forces that bypassed all known defensive systems. The barrier did not damage or destroy the approaching vessels, but it made clear that entry was not permitted. It was like trying to approach a soap bubble that had the strength of a planetary shield and the intelligence to defend itself. Captain Jennifer Stone commanded the communications division that tried every method available to contact whoever was inside the Sol system. They broadcast messages in hundreds of languages using every known transmission method. Radio waves, quantum signals, and exotic particle streams were all attempted. Nothing produced any response from within the barrier. The search fleet established a defensive perimeter around the Sol system and began a long wait. Representatives from the Galactic Council sent increasingly desperate messages explaining the crisis facing galactic civilization. They described the failing infrastructure, the spreading plagues, the economic collapse, and the growing conflicts that threatened billions of lives. Still, there was no response from within the barrier. The humans were either unable or unwilling to communicate with the outside galaxy. The search fleet settled in for what appeared to be an indefinite siege of their own allies. Weeks turned into months as the fleet waited outside the Sol system. Regular supply convoys arrived from the core worlds bringing food, fuel, and reports of worsening conditions throughout the galaxy. The agricultural crisis had spread to over 200 worlds. The economic collapse had caused the fall of several governments. Military conflicts were breaking out in sectors that had been peaceful for centuries. Dr. Narathul arrived with the medical fleet carrying refugees from plague-stricken worlds. The disease had evolved beyond all attempts at treatment and was spreading faster than ever. Entire species faced extinction if a cure could not be found soon. She brought detailed records of the plague's progression and samples for analysis, hoping that human medical knowledge might provide answers. General Caxorth commanded the military escort that protected the search fleet from increasingly bold pirate attacks. Criminal organizations had grown so powerful that they were now attacking military convoys in broad daylight. The breakdown of law enforcement had created a galaxy-wide crime wave that threatened to destroy what remained of civilized society. The months passed. It became clear that the situation inside the galaxy was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. Long-range sensors detected massive fleet movements in the Outer Rim territories. Unknown ships were approaching from beyond the galactic edge, moving with purpose toward the core worlds. The approaching vessels were huge, each one the size of a small moon. Their technology was completely unfamiliar, and their intentions were unknown. They did not respond to any communication attempts and seemed to be scanning inhabited systems as they passed. Whatever they were, they represented a new threat that the galaxy was completely unprepared to face. Admiral Seth Morrison realized that time was running out. The galaxy needed humanity's help not just to repair the damage caused by their absence, but to face this new threat that was approaching from the darkness between galaxies. The humans had obviously known this was coming and had prepared accordingly. The question was whether they would emerge from their self-imposed isolation in time to save the galaxy they had protected for so long. The barrier around Sol remained, impenetrable and silent, offering no clues about humanity's intentions or capabilities. All the search fleet could do was wait and hope that the Guardians who had walked away in silence would return before it was too late to save anyone. The invasion began without warning at the edge of the galaxy, where the first scout ships from beyond the rim had been quietly observing for months. The attackers came in massive vessels that moved through space like living mountains, each one larger than the biggest space stations ever built. They brought no messages, made no demands, and offered no negotiations. They simply began destroying everything in their path. The Outer Rim Defense Fleet tried to intercept the invaders near the Kepler system. Admiral Vextar commanded 200 of the galaxy's finest warships equipped with the most advanced weapons available. His fleet had successfully defended against pirate attacks and rebel uprisings for decades. They approached the unknown vessels, with confidence that their superior numbers and firepower would quickly end the threat. The battle lasted exactly 14 minutes. The alien ships moved with impossible speed and precision, their weapons reducing entire battle cruisers to cosmic dust with single shots. The defense fleet's shields and armor provided no protection against technology that seemed to ignore the basic laws of physics. Admiral Vextar's flagship was vaporized while he was still trying to understand what was happening. Only 3 ships escaped to carry news of the disaster back to the core worlds. The survivors described weapons that could destroy planets and defenses that nothing could penetrate. The invaders had not even slowed down during the battle, continuing their advance toward inhabited systems as if the galaxy's finest military force had been nothing more than an annoying obstacle. The Galactic Council received the survivors' reports in horrified silence. The beings who had attacked the defense fleet were unlike anything in known space. They seemed to consume the very fabric of reality as they advanced, leaving empty void where star systems had once existed. Entire worlds simply vanished as the invaders passed through their regions. Dr. Felnath at the Emergency Response Center tried to coordinate evacuation efforts as more systems fell to the advancing enemy. Refugee ships fled from the Outer Rim, carrying desperate survivors who told stories of planets being torn apart at the atomic level. The invaders did not seem interested in conquest or resources. They appeared to be destroying everything simply because it existed. Within 3 weeks, 47 star systems had gone completely silent. Long-range sensors showed only empty space where billions of beings had once lived. The enemy advance was methodical and unstoppable, moving toward the galaxy's core worlds with terrifying efficiency. Admiral Seth Morrison watched the reports from his position outside the Sol barrier with growing desperation. His search fleet was the largest military force still intact, but the recent battles had proven that conventional weapons were useless against the invaders. The galaxy needed humanity's help more than ever, but the energy barrier around Sol remained impenetrable and silent. The breakthrough came when Ambassador Lisa Barnes made a discovery while reviewing old diplomatic records. She found references to emergency protocols that Jake Morrison had established during his time as human ambassador. The protocols included specific communication codes that were supposed to be used only in the event of galactic catastrophe. Lisa convinced Admiral Seth to try broadcasting the emergency codes toward the Sol barrier. She transmitted Jake's old diplomatic identification, along with detailed reports of the invasion and desperate pleas for assistance. For 7 agonizing days, there was no response. The barrier remained intact, and the invaders continued their advance toward the core worlds. On the 8th day, the barrier simply vanished. What emerged from the Sol system defied all understanding of technology and physics. The human fleet that appeared consisted of ships that seemed to bend space around themselves, moving through dimensions that other species had never imagined existed. Their vessels were sleek and elegant, but radiated power that made the largest battle stations look like children's toys. Admiral Marcus King commanded the human response fleet from a ship that looked small compared to the massive alien vessels, but somehow felt more dangerous than anything the galaxy had ever seen. His message to the assembled search fleet was broadcast on all frequencies in a voice that carried absolute authority and calm determination. Marcus explained that humanity had withdrawn from galactic affairs exactly as they had stated. They had not abandoned the galaxy, but had never intended to manage its daily operations permanently. The withdrawal had been a test to see if the other species could learn to govern themselves responsibly. The results had been disappointing but not entirely unexpected. The real reason for humanity's isolation was revealed in the next part of Marcus's message. They had been preparing for the invasion that was now destroying the outer rim worlds. The attackers were called the Devourers, and they had been moving toward the galaxy for over 1,000 years. Humanity had spent 6 centuries building the defenses and developing the technology needed to stop them. The human fleet moved to intercept. The Devourers with weapons and tactics that seemed to violate every known law of physics. Captain Jennifer Stone's vessels could apparently move faster than light without using hyperspace. Dr. Amanda Foster's science ships created localized changes in the fundamental forces that held matter together. Engineer Gary Wilson's support craft could repair damage by reversing time around damaged areas. The Battle of the Galactic Core began when the 2 fleets met in the space between inhabited systems. The Devourers attacked with the same overwhelming force that had destroyed every previous defender. Their planet-killing weapons fired at the approaching human ships with energy that could have sterilized entire worlds. The human vessels absorbed the attacks without apparent damage and responded with weapons that turned the Devourers' own technology against them. Dr. Foster's science ships deployed devices that created zones where the invaders' weapons simply stopped working. Captain Stone's warships used tactics that allowed them to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The battle lasted 18 hours and could be seen from inhabited worlds dozens of light-years away. Space itself seemed to ripple and bend, as the 2 fleets exchanged weapons fire that released more energy than most stars produced in their entire lifetimes. Reality warped around the combat zone as technologies beyond galactic understanding clashed in a contest for the survival of civilization. When the last Devourer ship was destroyed, the human fleet regrouped around Admiral King's flagship. They had won a complete victory without losing a single vessel. The threat that had consumed 47 star systems and billions of lives had been eliminated by technology that made the invaders look primitive by comparison. Admiral King's final message to the galaxy was delivered from the bridge of his ship as the human fleet prepared to depart for unknown regions. He explained that humanity's role as the galaxy's guardians was ending. The crisis had proven that the other species still could not manage their own affairs responsibly, but humanity would no longer do it for them. The human fleet was returning to their own exploration of space beyond the galactic rim. They would leave behind automated systems to maintain the most critical infrastructure that kept inhabited worlds safe from natural disasters. Early warning networks would detect future threats from outside the galaxy. Medical databases would help prevent future plagues from spreading unchecked. But the daily governance of galactic civilization would be left to the species who actually lived there. Humanity had given them 6 centuries of protection and guidance. Now it was time for the galaxy's children to grow up and take responsibility for their own survival. The human ships departed for the darkness between galaxies, leaving behind a civilization that had been saved but forever changed. Every species now understood that they had been living under the protection of guardians they had never recognized or appreciated. The silence that followed humanity's second departure was not empty, but filled with the weight of responsibility finally understood. In the depths of space, human vessels continued their eternal watch over the galaxy they had protected for so long. They would return if truly needed, but only for threats that the galaxy could not handle alone. The greatest gift humanity had given the stars was not their technology or protection, but the hard lesson that true strength comes from taking responsibility for one's own survival. The galaxy had learned that some guardians protect not through dominance but through quiet competence, asking nothing in return except the chance to ensure that civilization could continue to grow and flourish in the vast darkness of space.